oaspete de la Universitatea din Canada, profesor David Coa, care este director fondator al unui centru foarte interesant, unic în spațiul nord-american, ce privește relația dintre comunitățile religioase, în mod general, și societatea civilă. Și acum de 30 de ani a fost director acolo. Într-un cadru a lucrat cu toate credințele lumii. Și din fiecare relație, cu fiecare cultură sau credință, a ieșit o experiență foarte interesantă și numeroase cărți. De aceea ne poate, sigur, vorbi foarte mult despre cum dânsul vede relația creștinismului cu islamul, pentru că a lucrat cu foarte mulți credincioși islamici, chiar a avut un rol în diferite situații unor persoane implicate în conflictele în ultima parte de vreme în lume. Chiar a lucrat bine cotată răspunderea creștinismului față de islam. De asemenea, din călătoriile sale în India, sau de relațiile sale cu lumea budistă, hindusă, așa mai departe, credințele din Orient, din Orientul depărtat, a ieșit o carte frumoasă, mantra, auzit divinul, ascultat divinul în India și Statele Unite, pe care o carte ca un fel de abecedat pentru comunitățile americane, mă refer în campus, cum ar trebui să trăiască studenții de diferite religii împreună într-un campus american. De asemenea, a fost tot timpul implicat în relația cu societatea civilă, cu societatea publică, cu instituțiile publice, promovând relația și implicația acestor instituții publice în centrele culturale ale societății și mai ales cu comunitățile religioase. Are o carte iară în acest sens, în 2013 a apărut la Universitatea Columbia, e foarte bună. Domnia s-a informat în state, în mare parte Universitatea din Chicago, cu studii de istorie, de filozofie, de credință a religiilor, Yale University, și așa mai departe. Este o persoană care iubește mult arta, încât timp de 30 de ani a lucrat într-un centru special cultural al Muzeului Regal din Edmonton. Așa că și în alte vizuale are foarte multe lucrări, chiar are și un film, Iisus în era televiziunii, premiat mai multe ori din anii 2000-2001, pe care și un premiu al reginei Elisabeta II ale Catolica Marii Britanii, ce are probabil, nu știu, peste 10 premii internaționale. Și este o persoană care este un educator, este un gânditor, e un filozof și, în ultima instanță, un teolog. În Universitatea din Alberta, sigur, rare ori, ci deseori, avea întâlnire cu cei de la medicină pentru a discuta diferite probleme care sunt de dialog sau care sunt provocări ale eticii medicale în general. Sigur, ne putem vorbi foarte mult și despre noi și despre români. Au fost foarte misteriade, cu care a studiat filozofia religiilor la Chicago, dar și de alți mari gânditori. Și este o persoană foarte deschisă dialogului, îi spuneam bun venit în începutul nostru și desigur el așteaptă de la dumneavoastră dialog. Cam aceasta este și sinteza vieții sale, care este centralizată, ideea de comuniune, ideea de dialog. Frumusețea și bucuria vieții, la profesorul David Coa înseamnă comuniune. Părinții lui provin din Norvegia, așa că am învățat multe lucruri și despre Norvegia în aceste zile și soția dânsului este din Germania. Și foarte interesant, autobiografia lui captează, este dulce. Dar, desigur, astăzi a venit pentru tot tema care nu e de rog ușor. Se spune un venit în mijlocul Universității de College.
See you. And thank you for the invitation to come and think with you a little bit and talk with you about a question that and a set of themes that from my point of view is so important for us to to think about together. So I hope you will be interested in entering into this. I have developed a center in Canada for the study of religion and public life. I often say that when religion and public life intersect, we have an accident. We usually get the worst kind of conversation instead of the best kind of conversation. In my country. Here in Romania, countries where some of you come from, that may be a bit different. But my attempt as a result has always been to try and find better ways of talking and thinking together about very demanding and difficult questions. Questions where there are not right and wrong responses, but questions where there are competing virtues, where there's more than one good that is at work. And to my mind, that's one of the great gifts of religion. At its best, religion has a capacity to hold a variety of virtues together and to think about them with care and with modesty. I periodically had the privilege of giving lectures to the medical school in Alberta, where there are several hundred students as well. And over the years, I've been invited to do this because I have spent a lot of time thinking about the way in which various religious traditions understand what it means to be a human being, understand what it means to be mortal, to be finite. Religious traditions have an amazing way of thinking about the nature of human suffering, about death and dying, and the memory of the dead. So I've been asked to address those things to medical students there. I suppose I began doing that kind of formally about 15 years ago. And I recall asking the students at that time, because there was a discussion in Canada about, it was a rather important case in the public eye of a woman who was suffering from ALS. Can you tell me what ALS is? You know what ALS is? It's a form of sclerosis. In North America, we often call it Lou Gehrig's disease because Lou Gehrig was a very famous American baseball player who suffered from it. And it's one of the most unbelievably debilitating diseases that can ever strike a human person. And so she was suffering from Lou Gehrig's disease. So that was in the news. She had requested the opportunity to end her life. And so I asked the students how many of them would be inclined to consider the role of the physician not in simply treating a person and trying to bring them to health, or at least to the best they can have, but in helping them end their life because their suffering was so grave. And on that occasion, perhaps 3% of the students at least formally admitted that they would be willing to consider that. Last year, when I asked that question in my country, in Canada, the response was about 90%. So that indicates an enormous shift in the culture. Now, my own sense is that 15 years ago, there probably was more medical students who actually would consider that, but would not want to be known to consider that. That kind of a shift in a culture is something worth paying attention to and trying to understand. and to think about the various things that are going on that lead to that kind of a shift in the culture. Because as you know, better than any of us, the medical oath that you take, the enormous training that you undergo, the substantial skill that you develop, the deep caring that has led you to do this work, the daily encounters with human suffering. It's such an enormous thing to take on that you are taking on. And I have nothing but unbelievable regard for you and for every person that chooses to spend their life coming alongside other human beings who are faced with small problems and ultimate problems, and to come alongside their families and their communities. It is, in my view, if Father Teofan will pardon me, you don't have to listen to this, Father Teofan. It is, in my view, the holiest of work. Actually, it's very much like the work of Father Teofan, because also being a priest is all about healing. I don't know how much you know about the Christian Gospels, but if you were to take out of the Christian Gospels all of the narratives about Jesus Christ healing people, you would have nothing left. And in the Christian tradition, the word used for human healing is the word salvation. It's the old Greek word, soterios. And it means rescue and healing. And of course the word mercy, a lovely word that we say so many times in the liturgy. Mercy has its root in Greek, eleison, in the olive tree. Why? Because olive oil for the ancient world, and even now a little bit, olive oil for the ancient world was always used to anoint wounds and to purify and to help people become elastic and capable again. In any case, I'm not going to ask you how many of you at this point in your thinking and your work, your study, would consider physician-assisted dying. But I ask you to think about it for the sake of our conversation together. So I want to say just a little bit about where this comes from in my country, in Canada. I expect that this kind of change in our law and shift in medical culture, I expect that this is going to roll across the world, and that at least many of you, at some point, if not already, are going to have to think this through and consider it and see where you stand on it and see how you want to engage that conversation in your own country and those concerns when you sit with human beings who are actually thinking seriously about the end of their life. We had a change in the law in Canada about a year ago, in June of last year, 2016. And it had, as I mentioned, that the modern debate had really begun about 15 years ago with a woman named Sue Rodriguez who suffered from this very serious disease. She had also become, I don't know the full details of this, but quite isolated from her family, her children, and was feeling very much alone in the world, as can so often happen. And the Civil Liberties Union, one of the organizations that argues for human rights in my country, had come alongside her to say, we can take your case and we can argue before the courts and see if we cannot, on the basis of human rights and personal autonomy, open the option for you when you wish to actually have a physician help you come to the end of your life. That case went to the Supreme Court of Canada, and the Supreme Court of Canada said no, it would not change the law. However, you know, after a number of years, the climate for this changes in a country. The climate for law changes. And that was about, I think, 18 months ago, if my memory serves me, something like that. And these cases were argued in a very similar way. And our Supreme Court made a very different decision. The Supreme Court was the argument, the technical legal, I won't go into the technical legal argument, you've got brothers and sisters who are lawyers, so we can leave that to them. The law in Canada that was of concern is the law governing assisting somebody to die. That's a very grave matter. If you help somebody commit suicide, if you counsel them to that, you know, there's a long tradition in human cultures about that matter. And a range of concerns. I mean, people can counsel somebody to die and construct the world in such a way around somebody who's actually their enemy, or around somebody whose death would benefit them in some fashion. So we have laws in many societies about this in Canada. And the law in Canada was very clear. Under no circumstance could you do that. So that's the law that needed to change, because now there was this interest in perhaps making it possible for somebody under certain conditions to request that a physician help them come to the end of their life. So the court did a very interesting thing. They made the decision that this law on suicide, helping somebody commit suicide, would be suspended in the case of somebody asking a physician to help them end their life, under certain conditions. And then they turned around and they said to the government, you have 1 year in which to clean this up and to write a law that actually shapes the way in which physicians can engage their patients and the conditions under which they can assist somebody legally to end their life. Now, the Supreme Court argued that under Canadian human rights legislation, you have the right, I think this is fascinating, you have the right to what they call the security of the person. You have the right to your life and to the security of the person. And they argued that if a person was suffering unduly, was perhaps coming close to the end of their life, or maybe not, just suffering enormously, and if they were in their right mind, that it was actually contrary to the right of the security of their person to prevent them from taking their own life. So it's always interesting to me the way lawyers work. I often think lawyers are almost all Jesuits. I don't know if you know the Jesuits, the big Catholic religious order, brilliant people, I know a number of them, and they have this amazing way of arguing. Or the Jewish rabbinical tradition also has this marvelous way of arguing and getting at things. So then the government was faced with having to write a law around this matter. And it passed that law in June of last year. I'll say just a little bit about it, because that's not really what I want us to talk and think about. I want to really go back behind this and think about what is it within our culture in Canada, and perhaps will be or is within your cultural world as well, that leads us to this place, and what are the sorts of things that perhaps we should be thinking about? And I'd be very interested in your thoughts on it. So the law that they passed was all about relieving suffering of terminally ill patients. It couldn't be applied to minors. It could not be applied to those suffering from mental illness, from depression, or from long-term disability, or from curable conditions. And the government wanted to prevent, it's a bizarre term, but what's called suicide tourism, which a number of people from Canada have gone to the Netherlands and Belgium, where they could end their life because they couldn't in Canada. They wanted to prevent that, so they said it could only be available to people that were covered under the Canadian Universal Health Care Act. The Universal Health Care Act in Canada came into existence because of an extraordinary Baptist minister from the small province of Saskatchewan back in the 60s, who became a member of Parliament and argued, and this is something that I treasure about my country, argued that we have a common responsibility for the health of each other. That's one of the ways we can express our common responsibility, because healthcare and medicine are way too large for any particular individual. We need to do that together and express our solidarity with each other. So that's where the Universal Health Care Act in Canada came together after a rather fearsome battle. They set in line a number of safeguards around this matter. Now, the truth of the matter is, I have argued when I've done some work on this, workshops on this law in Canada for medical personnel, I have made an argument that this isn't a medical issue. What do doctors have to do with having somebody die? All the doctors I know have mainly tried to do their best to help you not die. That this is a question about the meaning of life. And so to assume that somehow doctors have something to do with this, as doctors, is odd in and of itself. There are cultures in the world where you have religious specialists who deal with various aspects of life, and then another small group of religious specialists that are called in when somebody is dying, when somebody is going to leave this life, or when they have left this life. So the first thing that I suggest to you is that this isn't a medical question. It's actually a question about the meaning of life. Now, I'll suggest these things as avenues to think together about, so you can argue with me about them or frame it differently. But you are human beings. Each one of you is going to be a doctor, but you're a human being. And so this issue is a human issue, a profound human issue. And you are going to be in a very particular position in relationship to it, as a doctor and as a human being. And that's why it's so great, such a significant matter. So there are large philosophical, theological, religious issues here for us to think about. And by religious, I don't mean something that excludes people who claim not to be religious. I think Father Teofan mentioned I had the pleasure of studying with the great Romanian historian of religion, Mircea Eliade. And so, by religious, we mean all those great questions of meaning, all those ideas about the meaning of life that kind of help us hold life together. So, I've got lots of atheist friends, and they're as religious as anybody else I know. That is, they are thinking about questions of meaning in as serious a way. So, these great questions of meaning. So the first one that I want to suggest that lies behind this in my country is the notion of autonomy. We think that each autonomous human being has the right to make decisions about their life. Now that is a really significant point. It's a way of thinking about human beings that actually is not very old, like it's got a 300-year history. It's born out of the Enlightenment. And I think it's a gift. It's a great gift of the Enlightenment. But it also has limitations. And there's dangers in understanding it literally. Just like there are dangers in understanding religious ideas literally. It suggests that the individual is somehow separate from their mother and father, from their children, from their friends, from their lover, from their community, from those that care, from those that hate them. So, while autonomy is an important idea, is our personal freedom ever simply about us and not a matter of those that we know and care about? I have, when I first started thinking about this, I had a thought that I'd never had before in my life. You know, every once in a while one does. And that thought was that, and I'd be interested in your thought when you were thinking about this, that one of the least personal things that we will each face in life is our own death. One of the least personal things. And why? Obviously, it has a profound personal dimension. Don't get me wrong. But it's the least autonomous in the sense that everyone who dies changes the world. The world is no longer the same. And so for the people that surround you, or even the people that you're alienated from, the world is not the same anymore. So birth, the wonder of birth, and the mystery of death are two places where the world changes. And if that is the case, then it's odd, at least to me, to think that personal autonomy is where the emphasis, and the only emphasis should be, in making such a significant decision as the end of one's life. So that's one thing for us to talk about a little bit. The second one is, at least in my country, there's a common notion that you people are all gods. You know, you're gods. You can do anything and everything. And you can change everything. Now, we all know that you die, but we try to have that private off to the side so we don't realize it. And most doctors, of course, sometimes get out of their way before people die, so they don't have to put it on their record. But all I mean by that is there is this odd notion, and it's not your problem, it's part of certainly North American culture, that there's a technical solution for everything. We can take a pill or have a procedure to make everything possible. And when we can't, then I suppose we go to herbal solutions. So that's part of our culture that in Canada, that there's a technical solution, and of course there needs to be a technical solution to all pain, and indeed to all suffering as well. That is utterly extraordinary in terms of the history of culture. That is a new way of thinking. Now, there are reasons for it, because our modern science and technology have been amazing in what has been brought forth and what things you will have access to help people come to live better lives. And that is something to be lauded. But there is this further step of assuming that all suffering and pain, somehow or other, can be banished. That's peculiar in human culture, to have such a thought. The third thing that is striking to me about this is to think a little bit about the implications of our desire to control everything, not just birth, but also death. To actually have the personal control in our hands around death. To banish the spontaneous. To banish surprise. To banish everything we do not control. Think of the mindset and what the implications of that are. I suspect that most of us, well, maybe not, certainly me, I would find it really tragic to have had the spontaneous opportunity of falling in love to not be mine, to be banished. What a great part of the human experience that is. So what are the implications of this desire to control death and to banish the way it naturally unfolds? So my suggestion, this is another thing that I would love you to talk about. My suggestion, certainly in my own society, is that there's been an enormous failure of something that's been very important in human cultures before the technological age, at least in North America. And that is what in most cultures we would call the art of suffering and the art of dying. Most cultures give a great deal of attention to that. Here in Romania, in traditional culture in Romania, and to this day, among faithful people in the Orthodox Church, when somebody is suffering and somebody is dying, people gather. They gather. And there are, Father Teofan is called, priests are called, and there are people surround, and they have ways of putting language to this. Putting language to the mystery that is unfolding, of humanizing what can so often be nothing but traumatic. And there are ways of laying a human being gently in the ground. And then, in Romanian Orthodox culture, there is a series of gatherings around the memory of the person who has died. Because the understanding is really ubiquitous in human culture. That just because somebody dies doesn't mean they leave. Just ask any psychologist or therapist, atheist or otherwise. What are they spending their time doing? Spending their time talking to people about deaths that have happened in their life. Either physical ones or spiritual ones. The loss of a loved one. The loss of a beloved. Death comes in many forms. But when it comes, its shadows linger. And it's part of human culture at its best to help us grapple with those shadows and to integrate the meaning of the life of the other person for us, and to come to live healthily in relationship to their memory. that is part of the art of suffering and the art of dying, which in my society only still exists in small religious communities, of which there are less and less all the time. My sense is this has come about, in part, because those arts, those ways of understanding the meaning of life and the meaning of death, and the meaning of the memory of the dead, have become very thin. So, of course, behind it is this whole question of what do we really think suffering and dying is? And what is the relationship, the relationships that emerge, that come to the fore when people are suffering and when people die. Is there if we see a person die who has been abandoned by their family, by their friends, and certainly in the first year of physician-assisted death in Canada, the record is very clear. There are, I didn't check recently, but I think upwards of 300 people that have opted for this, at least at this point. And the vast majority of them are people who obviously could not bear their suffering, in some cases their pain, understandably, but who also were so deeply, deeply isolated. There was nobody standing with them, nobody in solidarity with them. So what are the relationships offered by that moment that unfolds sometimes over lengthy periods of time? What does it mean for a human being to actually come to accept their vulnerability? You're all young and will live forever. But one does come to certain points in life where one recognizes one's vulnerability. Is there something healthy, or that can be healthy, about awakening to that vulnerability? And something healthy about being able to accept others who stand with you in the midst of that vulnerability, who help you in the midst of that vulnerability. And on the other side, is there something uniquely healthy about human development and the human being's way of being, when in fact they can serve someone who's vulnerable? Now, all of you have chosen to do that with your life. So surely, to goodness, there is something significant in that for each of us in our daily walk. I would like to pick up on and just invite you to think about a little bit. In the Canadian law, and what lies behind it, there is this argument that everybody deserves a certain kind of dignity, and you need to have that dignity even when you're dying. What do we mean by that? What do we mean by that kind of dignity? In some of the arguments advanced in my country around this matter, you would think that dignity meant you didn't have to have help going to the bathroom. Now, I don't mean to demean that in any way, but dignity has become often for many a quite low-level consideration. I think it's a beautiful word, and there is no question in my mind that the dignity of a human being needs to be there from the cradle to the grave, and even after. But what does that dignity look like? What does it feel like? What does it require of us? How is it manifest? So those are some of the avenues I wanted to just raise and see if you're interested in talking about any of them a little bit, giving me a sense of how you think about these things. And no matter what you think about them, this is an open world. And your thinking about them is what is important. So have I said enough for you to pick up on a few things? Even if they are wounded. So is this issue alive for you? Yes, please.
I think
why don't you stand up and speak as loud as you can, because we want our colleagues to hear.
First of all, thank you very much. I think it was a lovely presentation, a lovely talk.
Do you hear back there? I'll repeat, so.
Oh, well, you've been
Maybe a couple sentences.
focusing on the patient that wants to die, the patient that needs assistant dying. However, what about thinking about the physician that's about to take his life? How's that going to affect him or her?
So we've been focusing on the, don't sit down, don't stand up. We haven't talked yet. You raised such a significant question. We've been thinking about the patients here, and I had this written down, but I ignored it because I was hoping you'd raise it. What about the physicians? What are the implications for the physicians? So just before I turn that question around to you, one of the key challenges to this law in Canada, as is often the case when we deal with human rights issues in my country, is the question of the freedom of conscience of the physician. Are physicians going to be required by law to do this? Well, in my country, we have at least a little bit of good sense. And at this point, obviously not. Physicians can opt out. They don't have to do this. But what's behind your, tell us a little bit about your sense of where physicians are in this and what the implications are.
I think you make it sound better, to make it look better by saying assisted death.
I'm sorry?
Like you say assisted death, where we're helping the patient die. But for me personally, I feel like I'm taking his life or taking her life, the patient's life, I mean. I don't think I could do it, regardless of whether it's he wants to do it or how much he's suffering or how intolerable the suffering is. And you said something important as well between the difference or the distinction between insufferable pain and intolerable pain, and intolerable suffering.
So our colleague has said that, if I've understood you correctly, you can't see yourself doing it. You find it too much to consider. That there is a serious conversation to be had about suffering and intolerable pain. Is that correct?
I think intolerable suffering would have to affect the quality of life, the dignity, as you mentioned.
It has to affect the quality of life, yes.
The dignity of the patient.
Pardon me?
The dignity of the patient.
The dignity of the patient. And then what if it does?
Then I'd have to refer him to
I can ponder that.
I'd have to refer him to a colleague who is willing
Yeah.
to help out. Personally, I think it's too much.
Wow. I mean, you highlight the struggle that I think physicians in my country are undergoing right now. Because in many cases they have good relationships with their patients. And they do everything they can. And then at this final stage of life, they're faced with this kind of professional quandary. On the one hand, I've been this patient's doctor for 30 years. And now, when they need somebody most, and they are asking me if I won't stand beside them and help them die. I mean, that becomes a kind of quandary in and of itself for some of them. Thank you. I talked with, I'll come to you in just one moment. I talked to my own physician, who I have a, vigorous conversation, but I sometimes, it's not true, but I was going to say I sometimes